Riot and revolution. Revolution has always been the method used to facilitate change, and it would seem likely that an environment could be created that would ultimately lead to a revolt by the citizens of this country. As our economy continues to decline, and it becomes harder for people to get by, there may be a groundswell of revolt across the country against the government. Of course, the Illuminati has already planted these seeds. As you have read, the Illuminati controls the leadership of the labor unions, and the corporate structure of America. Thus, a major strike could cripple this country. For instance, a strike by the Longshoremen would prevent anything from being unloaded off the ships. A strike by the Teamsters would prevent anything from being shipped on trucks. A strike by the air traffic controllers would prevent all flights, except for military planes. Basically, with a major labor strike, nothing would move, and there would be no way to get food and other products of necessities to the cities. Again, this would be a crucial blow to the economy. On top of that, and history has shown this, a major strike would most likely be accompanied with acts of violence and sabotage. Indeed, this situation would make it possible for the initiation of martial law, and a world government to step in to maintain control. It is a known fact that revolution has been fermenting in this country for a long time, and riots could be instigated through the many terrorist groups that exist here. Riots, bank robberies, racial confrontations, skyjackings, strikes, demonstrations, assassinations, and kidnappings are not just unrelated events, according to J. Bernard Hutton, who wrote in his 1972 book The Subverters that the increasing violence and terrorism is a direct result of an organized worldwide plot to destroy the Western democracies. The first hint of revolution came from the communists. Prominent U.S. Communist Gus Hall said at the 1961 funeral of Eugene Dennis, national chairman of the U.S. Communist Party, slit the throats of Christian children and drag them over the mourner's bench and the pulpit and allow them to drown in their own blood. As much as the government would like us to believe it, communism is not dead, only sleeping. When it awakes, most likely under the banner of socialism, it will be a force to be reckoned with. The communists, through their subversive agents in this country, have maps of all strategic locations, such as military firearm storage, police stations, fire stations, water hydrants, railroads and other transportation centers, communication centers, and water reservoirs and supplies. It wasn't too long ago that we discovered that Russia still has spies working within the CIA. Despite their overtures toward democracy, they are clearly continuing to follow an agenda to undermine the United States. The riots could be racially motivated. Percy E. Sutton, a former borough president of Manhattan in New York City, who is black, said in his keynote address before the National Conference of Anti-Poverty Agencies at Columbia University's Teachers College on February 22, 1968, that there was a plan to use thousands of black veterans from the Vietnam War to wage war on whites. He said, "I am afraid that the greatest battle of the era of the Vietnam War will not be fought in the demilitarized zone north of Da Nang, but will be fought in the streets of America." In April and May of 1992, after 4 policemen were acquitted in the beating of a black man, Rodney King, massive riots swept across south-central Los Angeles, and the military had to be sent in to restore order. It was reported that 600 buildings were burned, and 52 people killed. Damage estimates ran as high as $1 billion. Incidents were also reported in Atlanta, Las Vegas, San Francisco, Miami, and Seattle. Even though the blacks in this country have achieved quite a bit in the past 30 years, the fight against oppression has hardened them, and has created a generation that thinks nothing of using the political power of violence and demonstration to make their views known. This powder keg could be ignited again in the future, on a wider scale, in order to create a nationwide crisis. The riots could be radically motivated. Jerry Rubin, who was a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, at Kent State University, said on July 20, 1970, "The first part of the YIP program is to kill your parents. And I mean that quite literally, because until you're prepared to kill your parents, you're not ready to change the country. Our parents are our first oppressors." In his book Do It, he wrote, "We've got America, sick, on the run. We've combined youth, music, sex, drugs, rebellion with treason, and that's a combination hard to beat. High school students will seize radio, TV, and newspaper offices across the land. Police stations will blow up. Revolutionaries will break into jails and free all prisoners. The Youth International Revolution will begin with mass breakdown of authority, mass rebellion, total anarchy in every institution in the Western world." Jerry Kirk, a student at the University of Chicago, who was active in the Communist Party up to 1969, told the House and Senate Internal Security Committees, "Young people have no conception of the conspiracy strategy of pressure from above and pressure from below, so well outlined in Jan Kozak's And Not a Shot is Fired. They have no idea they are playing into the hands of the establishment they claim to hate. The radicals think they are fighting the forces of the super rich, like Rockefeller and Ford, and don't realize that it is precisely such forces which are behind their own revolution, financing it, and using it for their own purposes. In his book, The Strawberry Statement, Notes of a College Revolutionary, James S. Coonan, who in April 1968 was one of the students who took over Columbia University, wrote, "In the evening we went up to the U to check out a strategy meeting. A kid was giving a report on the SDS convention. He said that, at the convention, men from Business International roundtables tried to buy up a few radicals. These men are the world's leading industrialists, and they convened to decide how our lives are going to go. These are the guys who wrote the Alliance for Progress. They are the left wing of the ruling class. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago, 1968. We were offered SO, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon, Rockefeller, money. They want us to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move to the left. Another radical threat has come from militant homosexuals. On September 19, 1993, at the Sunday evening service of the Hamilton Square Baptist Church in San Francisco, California, Reverend Lou Sheldon of the Traditional Values Coalition was to be the scheduled speaker. Around 5 p.m., homosexual demonstrators began arriving, and by the time of the service at 6 p.m., so many had shown up that they completely controlled the area outside of the church, and they attempted to prevent people from entering the church, including the pastor and his wife. The protesters took down the Christian flag and hoisted the gay flag. Even though the police were there, they did nothing, claiming that the situation was under control. When the riot police finally were called in to force the gays out of the church courtyard, the rioters moved to the emergency exit doors on the west side of the church, where they pounded and kicked the doors, seeking to break them down. The noise was so disturbing that the service had to be temporarily stopped. I heard a recording of this on a radio show, and needless to say, it was very unnerving. As the churchgoers left, they were shouted and cursed at, and the speaker had debris thrown at him. A group of gay demonstrators were heard yelling, "We want your children. Give us your children." Through it all, not one arrest was made, because the police were told that this was an open public meeting and not a worship service, and therefore were not allowed to enforce the law regarding the disturbance of church worship services. Just like the civil rights movement of the 1960s, this may have very well been the beginning of gays exercising militant action to gain rights to carry out their perversive lifestyle, especially now that inroads are being made in regard to gay marriages. In a 1987 edition of Gay Community News, this interesting bit of information was published. "We shall sodomize your sons. We shall seduce them in your schools, in your dormitories, in your gymnasiums, in your locker rooms, in your sports arenas, in your seminaries, in your youth groups, in your movie theater bathrooms, in your army bunkhouses, in your truck stops, in your all-male clubs, in your houses of Congress, wherever men are with men together. Your sons shall become our minions and do our bidding. They will be recast in our image. They will come to crave and adore us. All laws banning homosexual activity will be revoked. All homosexuals must stand together as brothers. We will triumph only when we present a common face to the vicious heterosexual enemy. We will unmask the powerful homosexuals who masquerade as heterosexuals. We are everywhere. We have infiltrated your ranks. We shall conquer the world, because warriors inspired by and banded together by homosexual love and honor are invincible, as were the ancient Greek soldiers. The family unit will be abolished. All churches who condemn us will be closed. We too are capable of firing guns and manning barricades of the ultimate revolution. Regardless of who is involved in these riots, the police and the military will be mobilized to bring order. In 1965, the Department of Justice established the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance to help the local police fight crime. In 1968, as part of the Crime Control Act, it became known as the Law Enforcement Assistance Agency, LEA. Charles H. Rogovin, an administrator of the LEA, said in an October 1, 1969 speech to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, meeting in Miami, "If local law enforcement fails, then something else will replace it. I do not raise the specter of a federal police force merely to frighten you. Look at the organized crime field. We now see a substantial federal effort there, and not simply because organized crime is interstate in nature. It is also because law enforcement has failed to do its job." The LEA originally discussed the possibility of a national police force to be used in the event of a civil disturbance, for crowd dispersal and to neutralize revolutionary leadership. However, an article in the January 15, 1973 edition of the Boston Herald-American talked about the plans for reorganization, regionalization and consolidation of police departments. The Deputy Attorney General of California had said during a conference on civil emergency management that anyone who attacks the state, even verbally, becomes a revolutionary and an enemy by definition. They are the enemy and must be destroyed. On December 30, 1975, after it was signed into law by Governor Edmund G. Jerry Brown Jr., the California National Guard announced that they were prepared to provide emergency assistance to any local police force in the country. They introduced the 1,200-member Law Enforcement Assistance Force, LEAF, which was a specially trained and equipped military police force to handle mass disturbances and riots, which could be put into place within 12 hours. Although they were phased out in the mid-1980s, it appeared that LEAF was the forerunner of a national police force. This national police force began taking shape through the Multi-Jurisdictional Task Force, MJTF, a creation of the Department of Defense, and is a joint operation of FEMA and the National Guard Bureau. The idea was that, with less military involvement abroad, some of our military personnel could be reassigned to this type of domestic duty. The MJTF was to be the coordinating body of the BATF, FDA, CIA, DEA, IRS, federal marshals, National Guard, and local police organizations. Since 1971, there have been many reports concerning unmarked black helicopters, which, because of their flight paths, are probably equipped for low-flying ground surveillance, and appear to be part of the military's domestic counterterrorism program. Among the helicopters that have been observed, CH-47 Chinooks, which can carry 64 soldiers, MH-60G Blackhawks, AH-64 Apaches and HHG-0A Nighthawks. It has since been reported by various researchers that they originate from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, which is based in Ft. Campbell, Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and Hunter Army Airfield in Georgia. Although they have helicopters staged at various areas of the country for their use, they carry no markings, and they are the only helicopter unit in the U.S. military allowed to use the color of black, a special paint that is chemically resistant and invisible to radar, because they are a special operations unit that was initially used by the Delta Force, and now are being used by FEMA. They call themselves the Night Stalkers, and their motto is Death Waits in the Dark. And quote. It has been reported that a growing number of American military aircraft, with the exception of the Coast Guard, have been painted dark gray or dark green, and either have no visible markings identifying them as U.S. aircraft, or have low visibility markings. It is believed that the purpose for this is so our equipment can be easily transitioned for use as part of any United Nations operations. Since 1987, the U.S. Army has been training the police, local National Guard units, and the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, in how to break in and enter private property, as part of their new urban warfare training. The U.S. Army's Office of Public Affairs announced that the Defense Department Authorization Act passed by Congress in 1987 initiated this new training, which was being carried out in military bases such as Fort Hood, TX, Fort Benning, GA, and Fort McClellan, L. There have been reports of anti-terrorist training missions which have taken place throughout the country. Marines from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit at Camp Lejeune, NC, along with air support from the unmarked black helicopters, carried out a late-night raid in July 1993, on Tybee Island, near the mouth of the Savannah River. In early 1994, the Army and the Alaska State Police held a joint operation on the Kenai Peninsula, near Anchorage. In July 1994, Marines from the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit at Camp Pendleton, CA, held urban warfare training in different locations around Sacramento. In October 1994, Army Special Forces and the Detroit Police SWAT team engaged in anti-terrorist training missions at a vacant 6-story apartment house on West Alexandrine Street, and at a group of abandoned houses in Van Buren Township, a suburb of Detroit, near the Willow Run Airport. A mock city was constructed in the northern area of Fort Polk, in Louisiana, one of the Joint Readiness Training Centers. There are others in Fort Ord, California and Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, which was labeled a Military Operations and Urban Terrain Complex, MOOT. It is also the location of the North American Training Center for the United Nations. Smaller MOOTs are located in Fort Drum, NY, and Fort Indiantown Gap, PA, who have a model town called Johnson City that is used for urban warfare training. The FBI had established an anti-terrorist training compound at the abandoned Brown and Root Incorporated construction yard in Belay-Chassé, Louisiana, just south of New Orleans. The purpose of this urban warfare training was nothing more than the perfection of house-to-house searches and controls on the civilian population, which will be used to disarm the American people through force. It has been suggested that the UN operations in Somalia and Haiti were used as practice runs for disarming the civilian population. However, before this can happen, a massive gun law will have to be passed, so that all the guns will be confiscated. In 1970, the FBI estimated that the private citizens of the country had a total of 90 million weapons, including 35 million rifles, 31 million shotguns, and 24 million handguns, while the armed forces only had a small arms inventory of 4.8 million guns. Estimates in the early 1990s placed the number of registered handguns in this country at 70 million, and the number of unregistered at 50 million. The Illuminati will not instigate any kind of uprising if Americans will be able to defend themselves. Because of this, there has been a massive attack on our constitutional right to keep and bear arms. Quote. The extended waiting period mandated by the Brady Bill was only the beginning. There have been other bills introduced in Congress to ban guns. Senator Howard Metzenbaum said during a 1993 Senate hearing. Until we can ban all of them, then we might as well ban none. He also said, the best way to keep handguns out of the wrong hands is through licensing. Licensing is a barrier to gun crime. At his Senate confirmation hearings in 1993, FBI Director Louis Freeh said, the strongest gun legislation, I will enforce diligently and exhaustively. U.S. Surgeon General Joycelyn Elders said, handguns are a public health issue. Senator Joseph Biden said, banning guns is an idea whose time has come. Representative Mel Reynolds said on CNN's Crossfire, if it were up to me we'd ban them all. From the 1970s to 1990s the incidents of violent crimes have more than doubled. They have become more heinous to the point of being repulsive, and the government's view is to disarm the criminal, but also at the same time, they want to also disarm law-abiding citizens. Bill Clinton, as quoted in USA Today, March 11, 1993, page 2A, said, we can't be so fixated on our desire to preserve the rights of ordinary Americans. The move for gun control is snowballing, and that is part of their plan. In 1994, the National Rifle Association got their hands on a secret document which represented the blueprint for the gun control lobby in this country. The first step was to use the media to create a clamor for gun control in this country, and this would in turn sway the opinion of a large portion of the population to support such a measure. The second step would be the initiation of gun control legislation that would establish annual licensing fees and surcharges on ammunition. After 2 years, the third step would involve a massive increase in the licensing fees. The reason given would be because of the costs involved to enforce the law, when in fact, it would be to discourage ownership. The failure to get a license would result in a $1,000 fine and / or 6 months in jail, and if your license lapses, your failure to turn your guns over to the government would result in a $15,000 fine and / or 18 months in jail. Both instances also result in the loss of the right to own a firearm. After 2 more years, the fourth step would call for further legislation to increase the licensing fees even more. Their ultimate goal is to reduce the number of licensees to 0. In this way, the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States will be circumvented in order to take the guns out of the hands of the American people. After that, the population will be defenseless against government forces. They hope to accomplish this within 15 years. Noah Webster said in 1787, before a standing army or a tyrannical government can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every kingdom in Europe. There was a law passed that tells us what the mentality of the government is concerning this issue. On September 26, 1961, Public Law 87-297 or the Arms Control and Disarmament Act was signed. It created the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency as an agency of peace to deal with the problem of reduction and control of armaments looking toward ultimate world disarmament. Section 3A describes disarmament as the control, reduction, or elimination of armed forces and armaments of all kinds. Section 31A indicates that the agency is to engage in study and research to achieve the limitation, reduction, control, and elimination of armed forces and armaments. This information can be found in the United States Code, Volume 9, Title 22, Foreign Relations, Chapter 35, Arms Control and Disarmament, Sections 2551 to 2595. Even though the agency is active in negotiations regarding foreign policy, you can be sure that all such negotiations include the same concessions for America. In the February 14, 1963 edition of the Washington Report, Congressman James B. Ute said that this Disarmament Act sets up a superagency with power greater than the power of Congress, which delegated it. The law was almost a duplication, word for word, of a disarmament proposal by the Kremlin in 1959. The disarmament legislation was passed for the purpose of implementing the Department of State Publication 7277, entitled Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. Will the U.S. military go against American citizens if so ordered by the federal government? It was reported that a 46-question survey was handed out in May, 1994, to 300 randomly selected Marines, veterans of the Panama Operation and the Persian Gulf War, at the 29 Palms Marine Corps Base in the Mojave Desert about 70 miles east of San Bernardino, California. The soldiers were asked for their reaction to various statements, such as U.S. military troops being commanded by UN officers, whether the President has the authority to pass his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief to the UN Secretary-General, and if they would serve in a United Nations military force to maintain world peace. The survey was concluded with this: the U.S. government declares a ban on the possession, sale, transportation, and transfer of all non-sporting firearms. A 30-day amnesty period is permitted for these firearms to be turned over to the local authorities. At the end of this period, a number of citizen groups refused to turn over their firearms. Consider the following statement: I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse or resist confiscation of firearms banned by the U.S. government. After the news of this survey surfaced in the Spotlight and the November issue of American Legion magazine, it was later reported that it was part of a soldier's master thesis at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and did not reflect any government program. However, the February 1994 issue of Modern Gun magazine reported that a similar survey had been given to some Navy SEALs. The thesis, called Peacekeeping and UN Operational Control, a study of their effect on unit cohesion, had been classified until March 1995, when it was approved for public dissemination. In response to the question about swearing allegiance to the UN, 208 Marines said they could not do so, 117 of those strongly disapproved, and 71 said they could, with 19 of those strongly approving. And, in regard to the infamous question 46, of the 264 Marines who responded, 185 said they would be opposed to firing at Americans, with 127 strongly opposing, and 79 said they would be willing to shoot if ordered, with 23 strongly affirming. So, the bottom line is, if ordered, 1 out of every 4 Marines would shoot American citizens. What this survey revealed was that, for the most part, our military probably could not be relied on to act as a cohesive force to fire upon the citizens of this country. However, with increased indoctrination, that could change, but I don't think there is time for that. Therefore, the deck had to be stacked. On November 11, 1990, President George Bush signed an executive order that authorized the presence of UN battle groups in the U.S., and there are 15 reported to be here. Before leaving office, in a major speech to the United Nations, Bush said that the United States would permit UN troops to use various military bases for training purposes, and multinational field exercises. The military staff of the UN Secretary-General had called for a rapid response peace force of 60,000 soldiers, for instant deployment, a permanent peacekeeping force of 275,000 soldiers, for conflict control, and a standing reserve peace force of 500,000 soldiers for UN duty wherever necessary. On March 16, 1993, Senate Joint Resolution No. 65 called for the establishment of a commission to study the creation of a standing international military force under the United Nations Charter. In 1993, Clinton issued Presidential Review Directive, PRD, No. 13, supporting Boutros Ghali's, UN Secretary-General, proposal for a UN military force, substantially made up of Americans. However, General Colin Powell, commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, insisted on a codicil that said, if any U.S. commander believed his orders violated the U.S. Constitution, or placed our country or military forces at risk, the orders could be disregarded. On May 3, 1994, Clinton signed the Presidential Review Directive No. 25, which put U.S. military commanders under the authority of the UN during UN military operations, and instructed the Department of Defense to establish a U.S. military organizational structure which included the United Nations. It was PRD No. 13 without the Powell Codicil. On June 24, 1994, the National Guard Bureau, an agency of the Department of Defense, which coordinates all the state National Guard units, developed the National Guard state partnerships with the Russian Federation, which enabled troops from 14 of the newly formed Russian Federation, as well as other countries in East and Central Europe, to train in this country with the National Guard units of some states. According to Clinton's Bridge to America proposal, the purpose of these partnerships was to assist the participating nations' transition to democratic military institutions with peacetime utility and providing military support of civilian authorities. Troops who were attached to the Russian Interior Ministry were seen training with the U.S. 10th Special Forces Group, who were being reassigned to Fort Carson, Colorado. The Russian soldiers were still wearing the red berets bearing the hammer and sickle, the symbol of communism. Russians have also been seen training with the SWAT team of Las Vegas, Nevada, and were reportedly involved in joint military training operations in Alaska and Alabama. Belgian troops were seen in North Dakota and Montana. German soldiers were seen training at Luke Air Force Base near Phoenix, Arizona, as well as Fort Bliss, TX, and Fort McClelland, L. There have been reports of 19,000 UN troops in Fort Polk, alleged site of a large underground facility, Louisiana, consisting of French, Pakistani, and 2 battalions of Russian soldiers, 600 UN troops near Dulce, New Mexico, 40,000 UN troops staged in Sacramento, California, as well as 40,000 UN troops in San Diego, 22,000 UN troops just south of Los Angeles, 50,000 National Guard and UN troops located near Barstow, 43,000 UN troops in the Texas Panhandle, and 14,000 UN troops in Anchorage, Alaska. The use of Fort Dix in New Jersey, a major East Coast base, in an area of 50 square miles, right next to McGuire Air Force Base, was fully committed for UN purposes. Razor wire now surrounds some parts of this base, and there was a sign pointing the way to an enemy prisoner of war compound. In addition, in May 1991, the German government negotiated a deal with our government, which gave them permission to establish a German military facility in our country. There hasn't been a foreign military presence here since Great Britain's occupation during the War of 1812. Foreign soldiers have been training with American troops in order to function as a cohesive multinational unit that will operate under the authority of the United Nations. A multinational UN military force stationed in this country would fire upon American citizens. Journalist Pam Schufert, author of Premonitions of an American Holocaust, while she was in Germany, asked some soldiers if they knew that German troops were training at Fort Bliss in Holloman, and if they were there for the hour of martial law, to help arrest Americans and seize their weapons and fire upon them if they resist. One of them replied, "Yes, we have heard all this, and it is true." Russia-made T-72 main battle tanks have been spotted on our nation's highways, being hauled on flatbed trailers. It is reported that at least 30th of May have been brought here. One government response was that they were being used in military war games. Also seen were Soviet surface-to-air missiles and surface-to-surface missiles, a Soviet Hind D attack helicopter, and a Soviet Helix anti-submarine naval attack helicopter were seen at the Gulfport National Guard facility in Mississippi. Hundreds of railroad flat cars have been seen with both Russian and UN equipment. Representative Gene Taylor, DMS, reported that the aircraft, as well as hundreds of other pieces Russian-built equipment, were being purchased and used for training purposes. And he's right, urban warfare training. Hundreds of Soviet Z-1L-131 military trucks were photographed in Saucier, Mississippi, which were imported from East Germany with a UN bill of lading by Airmer Resources Corporation. They were said to be used, and were to be reconditioned and sold. However, many only had a little more than 1,000 miles on them. They were to be painted white, marked for UN use and shipped to Africa, yet many of them have been sent to destinations in this country. There was a report from Montana concerning 3 train loads of military vehicles, some painted white and marked with the UN designation. The evidence seems clear, that our government is stockpiling military equipment in preparation for a massive assault against the American people if necessary. It is believed that there are now over 30 foreign military bases in this country under the United Nations flag, that are manned with 1 million foreign troops. Because our soldiers could not be counted on to fire upon American citizens, they have been sent overseas as UN peacekeepers, while foreign troops have been brought in that will follow orders to detain, and shoot, anyone who is a threat to the New World Order. The attack on David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas may have been just a glimpse of what is going to happen in the future to groups who don't toe the government line, in order to control the population, rather than the wholesale slaughter of people that would further turn public opinion against them. Large groups of people will be rounded up to be sent to detention centers for questioning, incarceration, or worse. Michael Maholey, who for 20 years was a naval intelligence agent, said about the detention centers, "Oh, all of us in the intelligence community know about the concentration camps in America. We all know that they are to terminate the resistors of the New World Order under martial law."